I would like to ask you to welcome Miss Vela Martinez to do her talk on Fantasy on High.
The process of writing, I have come to learn, is a mixed emotional high of feeling like God and wanting to be the soda can you just saw get run over by a car. Hi, my name's Vela Martinez, and welcome to my Masterworks presentation on creative writing. Writing can pull at your brain in ways you wouldn't even know were possible or want to be possible. So why do I enjoy it? Well, I've always felt good writing, creating different worlds where I can suspend belief and bring a whole cast of characters to life. Masterworks was a way to unleash my imagination by creating what would end up being 4 stories in 4 completely different genres. My stories range from thriller to crime drama, from science fiction to historical fiction. Today, I will focus on the process of writing and issues I came across throughout my stories. I will lead you through the 4 different short stories I wrote and talk about the part of the writing process that was most relevant to that story. I'll be sharing the highs and lows of writing my anthology, Fantasy on High, whether it be in the context of writer's block or inspiration. I want to shed some light on what creative writing is really like for me as a young person, and hopefully give you some truth on the process. Writing can suck. It can be hard. Organizing your ideas is messy, but most things that require creativity are like that. But it can also be very fun and very rewarding. So why did I choose writing as my masterworks? Well, back in April of 2017, my English teacher and now Masterworks advisor, Charlotte, had my class write short stories under the genre of horror. Our stories had to be over 1,000 words and somewhat scary. I wrote a 2,000-word story titled Case 189, one of the stories I will be talking to you about today. After I handed in my story, Charlotte said it was terrifyingly brilliant and gave me full marks for it. And we eventually decided to submit it to a writing contest called the Monkey Collective. It's now mid-August, and there, in bold, was a new email sitting in my inbox. The way the contest worked was that the 300 people who submitted their stories were to read other people's entries and vote for the stories they liked best. Not expecting anyone to vote for Case 189, I voted for my own and 2 other stories. The contest said that the top 15 stories with the most votes would get compiled into an ebook and sold on Amazon. I didn't expect to win. I finally opened the email with the results and scrolled through the top 15. Case 189 wasn't there. Archiving the email, I saw there was another email from someone named Madeline with the subject as, "Your entry in the competition." I opened it and read this. "Dear Eden, thanks so much for your entry into this quarter's competition. Case 189 was popular with our members and gained a number of votes, but unfortunately not quite enough for it to get into the top 15, and it ended up just outside. Given the amount of entries we've had, this was still a great achievement. Please keep up the writing and keep sending your stories into us. Best wishes, Maddie." I nearly lost it. Out of 300 Canadian writers who weren't my age or even close to it, I ended up just outside the top 15. This meant that my writing was worth something, and that it really was good. That email was my spark. Speaking of sparks, let's talk about inspiration. Inspiration can be found literally anywhere, from a book, a stranger on the bus, or a story your friend told you. Once you have an idea, pursue it. That is what I did with my second story, A Criminal Tie, but I shall elaborate on that aspect later. Once you have an idea, jump on it, tackle it. WWE smackdown that sucker into reality. Write it down, start brainstorming plot points, brainstorm everything. The best part of creating a story is just daydreaming about it while listening to music. Take as much time as you need to feel out the story. So now is where the fun begins. I will now be immersing you in the chaotic 6 months in which all my stories were written, and I will share my experience with the creative process of writing 4 different short stories. These stories, although being entirely different from one another, are all kept within the same book, my anthology of short stories, Fantasy on High, A Curious Blend of Stories. Let's start from the very beginning in April of 2017. Case 189, as I mentioned earlier, was the first short story I wrote. As I mentioned, it began as an English project. Luckily for me, I had just finished reading a Stephen King novel, Mr. Mercedes, and with these images fresh in my mind, I had lots of inspiration for the horror part of the story. What eventually resulted, after many late nights, was a 2,000-word story about a schizophrenic psychopath who was locked up in an asylum in Iceland. For those who are unaware, schizophrenia is a mental illness that causes patients to hallucinate, have delusions, become socially detached, hear voices that aren't there, and have disorganized thinking and speech. Brady H. Williams and Camilla Bates are the characters we focus on in the story, as we get to witness Brady from his own perspective and an outsider's point of view. I ended up having 2 editions of this story. One I submitted for the writing contest, and one I expanded on in September of 2017. So I had an idea of what I wanted Case 189 to be about. Where did I start writing? The first part of Case 189 that I wrote was the ending. I wrote the story backwards, from end to beginning. Why did I do it this way? From what I've learned, it's best to write the part of the story that is most vivid in your mind and work your way from there. If you try to write the beginning, but really the climax is what's most visible in your head, you won't be able to focus on writing the beginning really well, then move on to the next clearest, and so on and so forth. If the clearest parts are chunks from the beginning, and then a chunk from the middle, and then the ending, focus on connecting all of them together at the end once all your ideas are on paper. Your brain should be focused on what you're writing in the moment, not what you need or are going to write. Case 189 is the only one of my 4 stories that doesn't end with some form of cliffhanger. The story is wrapped up rather nicely, as opposed to my other stories where you're left wondering what happens next. So how do I choose whether or not to cliffhanger a story? The biggest factor that plays into this decision is laziness and how the ending will affect the story. Ending stories where I do often saves me from writing 3,000 excess words that I don't necessarily need to finalize the story. In terms of how the ending affects the stories, a good example is when movie makers write a sequel to a film when it didn't need one. Sometimes it's good to leave people wondering. It allows their imaginations to fill in the gaps. Sometimes writing proper endings with everything finished neatly drags the story on for too long. And for these parts of the writing process, I would only say to write on your own terms. It's your story. So Case 189 is the darkest story and is very realistic. So now let's talk about unrealistic. Alien invasion, abduction, life in the 26th century. Aliens and creatures never before seen by mankind. I present to you, Aliens Prefer Decaf. Aliens Prefer Decaf is one of my favorite stories I've written. I'm a people watcher, and I enjoy watching people go about their daily lives and pick out defining features of their characters, such as a defining item of clothing, visible scars, or the way they walk. There's always an element of someone's life that can be used in a story. So one night last year, I'm on the 250 going from Horseshoe Bay to downtown, and 2 college-age young men get on the bus, one blonde, the other brunette. Both are carrying computer bags, yet wear casual clothing, suggesting they are still in school. They begin to talk about programming. The bus continues along, and I see a poster for Alien Covenant. My imagination was already going. What if all of humanity was killed off by aliens, and only the blonde computer science major was left? This small idea was then tucked away in my imagination, and I wouldn't even begin developing that idea until October of 2017. In the context of Aliens Prefer Decaf, I'll be talking about creating and developing the characters and the world in which the story takes place. Our story revolves around Benjamin, or Benji, Fletcher, and Harriet. Benji is a computer sciences major in university and minors in math twice a week. Benji works at a cafe in the afternoons and on weekends and has one best friend named Walt Andrews. Harriet is the most advanced AI to be created, her mind containing the complexity of a human brain and a supercomputer, while her body is as real as any human's. Antisocial, rational, smart, and superhuman. That's Harriet. Harriet and Benji meet in the year 2537 when she crashes through Benji's living room window on the 71st floor. But that's a story for another time. Now, coming up with aliens is both very fun and very hard to do. I mean, for most of us, there is only one alien, depending on how old you are. If you are maybe 20 and older, you think of the Xenomorph from Prometheus. And if you are under 20, you might think of a small green dude with a big head and huge black eyes. Luckily for me, when you are reading a novel, most of the time there are no pictures to aid your imagination. That means all I have to do is describe the foundation of an alien creature, and your imagination fills in the gaps for me. The word alien refers to a fictional being from another world, so technically, I could get away with humanoid creatures as being alien, so long as they didn't originate on Earth. So guess what I did? Meet Hane, a cyborg monster. Hane is mostly human, but suffers from a genetic mutation called the xenodaemonium defect, meaning the foreign demon's defect. This disease causes Hane's skin to take on unusual forms, slowly mutating itself into metal parts and wolf skin. This disease works in 5 stages. The first is the discoloration of the left eye, turning to a pure gold color. The other stages involve the slow but steady mutation of the skin, and finally the brain, as seen in the final stage, where the human body is completely transformed into that of a demon's. The first cases of the xenodaemonium defect occurred when aliens experimented with turning humans into cyborgs. Unbeknownst to the aliens at the time, lead is poisonous to humans. In March, I hit a stop. I think a lot of people can relate to how I felt, whether they are writers or not. The only way I can phrase it is that I lost my inspiration. I couldn't compel myself to write any more on Aliens Prefer Decaf. I had deadlines, so I couldn't take a break from writing and then come back later, refreshed. I needed to get it done, which is why I made the executive decision to cliffhanger my science fiction story earlier than intended, ending it after Benji and Harriet teleport to the first planet, Icefo. Yes, this does mean that there are 4 other planets and numerous more characters and aliens and plot points hidden in my brain that didn't make it into this edition of Aliens Prefer Decaf. I couldn't rush this story. I had crafted the beginning so well during the month of February, and I knew if I tried to finish it before my April deadline, along with all my other stories, the quality would go downhill. When I am ready, I shall return to Benji's world and wrap up his travels, but it will not be in time to introduce the rest of his world to everyone today. Benjamin Fletcher will have many other great adventures with his companion, Harriet, but for now his world is tucked away on a shelf because we all need a much-deserved rest. I will now share an excerpt from Aliens Prefer Decaf. I hope you enjoy. The carless, store-lined street was illuminated by several street lamps, the traffic lights alternating colors pointlessly. Benji pulled his keys out of his pocket and hustled towards one of the closed shops, the dark green awning cutting sharply into the darkness. Benji tucked his book bag under his arm and fumbled the key into the front door's lock, stepping in from the brisk air to be encased in the fading heat of the shop. It smelled mildly of burnt coffee beans and vanilla. Benji felt his way around the 2 seat tables and ran his hand along the wall, grasping for the light switch. He flicked on the old-style light switch and squinted as warm light was cast all around the cafe. Benji rummaged through the contents under the oak counter and pulled out his computer sciences textbook, its cover worn and scrawled over with Sharpie. Benji slipped it into his book bag and stood up, thwacking his head on the counter. He grit his teeth and rubbed his head, muttering incomprehensible curse words under his breath. As Benji's eyes once again focused on the empty street, visible through the lettered windows, he saw a blinding flash of green light streak across the road. Benji did a double take and felt his heart miss several beats as slowly, one by one, the street lamps flickered and then went out. Benji dropped his book bag and ran to the window, both his hands on the glass like a child at the zoo. He stood with his eyes fixed on the vacated street, peering into the darkness, trying to make out the shapes in the gloom. Suddenly, the green flash appeared again, and 6 twinkling blue lights illuminated a large rectangular metallic object that stood where the green flash had been just moments ago in the middle of the street. Benji's hair stood up on his arms, and his eyes darted over the surface of the 6-legged machine that looked like it was from another galaxy. It was bulky and clearly wasn't designed to go very fast. Benji knew this from an aerodynamics class he'd taken in his last year of high school. The machine was emitting steam from several pipes and had 6 long legs tucked up beside its knobbly body. Its hinged jaw fell on the pavement with a thud, and a puff of blue smoke issued from within the machine, followed by a beam of white light. What looked like a long, fingered hand slowly reached out from within the machine, and another hand followed. The hands were followed by a horned head, a spiny body, 2 very long and muscular legs and a whip-like tail. The creature stood on the fallen door, silhouetted by the light coming from within the machine. Benji watched, transfixed, as the 4-legged creature tasted the air with its long tongue and made a loud hissing noise. 2 more 4-legged creatures appeared from within the machine and made similar hissing sounds, communicating with the first. The 3 creatures slipped out of the beam of light, making way on the ramp for a 4th creature. This one was different than the others, however, as it sported a humanoid silhouette and wasn't nearly as big as the 3 cat-like creatures that now hovered at the newcomer's side. The stranger turned towards the light, and Benji saw its face and nearly screamed. Its face was not human. It had tubes sprouting from its scalp, and its skin was rough and had a pale pink hue, like it had been burned. Benji stepped away from the glass, his eyes never leaving the creatures that stood outside. The thick silence was cut by the ring of Benji's cell phone, and the 3 creatures snapped their heads around to look at Benji with big, glowing green eyes. The humanoid figure spoke, and the 3 animals hissed, loping towards Benji and the cafe with incredible speed. Benji's mind froze, his instincts unable to move his legs. My 3rd story I began writing before Aliens Prefer Decaf, but wouldn't finish until afterwards. Like Case 189, it's based in crime, but it definitely isn't as dark and is more of a crime drama than a thriller or horror story. Let's talk about the mafia. The Italian mafia originated in Sicily during the 19th century, and during the 20th century, the Italian and American mafias were the most successful gangs in the world, and they are still in business today. Sometime in late November, my mom was telling my dad and I a story about a few family friends who, while in Italy, may have witnessed a mob hit. Apparently, after leaving the airport, they ended up stopping for dinner in a diner, and after maybe 10 minutes, 2 masked men came through the doors, shouting in Italian and holding up machine guns. The masked men told everyone to get on the floor, in Italian, and our friends got on the floor and put all their valuables like phones, passports, money, car keys, in front of them, shutting their eyes and praying that they would live. They heard the masked men moving around the diner and threatening the owners before they heard nothing. People around them started to move, and the masked men were gone, having taken nothing off the customers, just threatening the owners and leaving. Of course, it's an awful thing to experience, but what a great story starter. I knew I had to turn it into a story. It was a great opportunity. The result is a 4,500-word story on the Italian mafia following a man named Luca Moratti. Luca is introduced to the story as a low-ranking enforcer of organized crime, but due to the death of heir Cesare Moratti, he's promoted to be the new successor who would eventually inherit the family. Luca's job gets a whole lot harder when it's revealed that Cesare was murdered in cold blood. One thing I want to talk about is how the title for the story came to be. I have learned that anagrams, rearranging letters to get a new word, can be very helpful and very clever. For example, I took what my story is about, Italian crime, and put it into an anagram machine which spat out a criminal tie. Now, even though that was very creative of me, I was not always in the mood to write a criminal tie. A criminal tie, although it is one of the shorter of my 4 stories, took the longest for me to write, in comparison to Grave of Sand, which is the shortest story, which took me 2 weeks to write. A criminal tie took me around 3 months. It was a very stop-and-start process with this story. At one point, I even considered scrapping the whole thing. Why? There were points when I just couldn't write the story. It wasn't writer's block. I wasn't out of ideas. I felt like I was out of inspiration and motivation to write the story. I knew what I needed to write. I knew how to do it. I just couldn't bring myself to. Criminal Tie just lost me. I couldn't see where the story was going anymore. I felt very detached from the characters and from the entire storyline. But I struggled through, and finally, on April 18th, 2018, I completed A Criminal Tie after a week of hard writing, rearranging, and editing. Writing A Criminal Tie was a very spur-of-the-moment idea, and maybe that was why my interest died. Regardless, I finished the story, and I still believe it is worth all the time spent on it. The moral of the story, is that perseverance gets the job done. It is now time, ladies and gentlemen, to move on to the last story on our roller coaster ride of writing. This story is set in the past and takes us away to a place quite unlike here. Let's flip perspectives and go back to the 20th century. Grave of Sand was the last story I wrote in my anthology and was the quickest for me to write. The story revolves around an English history professor named William, an Egyptian cartographer called Salim, a Spanish navigator named Omar Consuelos, and a Hungarian archaeologist by the name of Laszlo Fero, who gets stranded in the desert flying from London to Beijing. This story is one of my favorites and is the most different from the rest of the stories, as it is written in first person in the form of journal entries. I didn't always have plans for it to be like this, though. I began working on my historical fiction story on March 30th. Now in October, I had plans to write a historical fiction story based on a war veteran in 1920s London and have it play out like a thriller. I had characters made, the plot line was written out, and the setting was established. When it came time for me to write my historical fiction, I just wasn't as drawn to this Sherlock Holmes-esque storyline, and I wanted to do something else. I had no idea what, but I kept remembering Michael Orangi's The English Patient, despite the fact that I read that book over a year ago. The English Patient is a book that tracks the lives of 4 people at an Italian villa near the end of World War II: a nurse, a soldier, a thief, and a badly burned Englishman, come to forge an unlikely family. I developed an idea about an Englishman, a professor, who found himself stranded in the Gobi Desert of Mongolia after a plane crash with a few other men. The only real planning I did for Grave of Sand was a bullet point list of major plot points that sat at the top of my documents for 2 weeks while I wrote the story. Afterwards, Charlotte and I edited the story, and it was finished. But let's talk about the part of writing any historical fiction story: research. Before writing Grave of Sand, I had to do math. I had to calculate how long it would take the quartet of men to get from London to Beijing in a plane from the 1920s, which meant factoring in speed and fuel. I had to figure out what the specs would have been for a biplane in 1927, how fast they could go, the cruising speed, and the capacity of the fuel tank. I had to figure out how long it would take this plane to use up all the fuel, and how long it would take the plane to fly a certain number of kilometers at a certain speed, which allowed me to figure out how many fuel stops the plane would need to make. The end result was 2 pages of math. What role did this math play in my story? I've often heard that when writing historical fiction, do as much research as you need, but not too much, because then there's no room to have fun with the story. Good creative writing is meant to be fun and is intended to suspend belief. But if I'm being honest, doing research is what has always held me back from doing a historical fiction story until now, because I wanted to get everything right. I didn't want to have my work published and have someone write to me saying, "Hey, that fact is wrong." So when I decided I would be doing a historical fiction story for my Masterworks, looking back, I think I did it to spite myself. I did not enjoy doing 2 pages of math just so I could figure out how long it would have taken to get from London to Beijing in 1927. I also had to do research on the diplomatic relationships between the different countries at that time, seeing as it was post-World War I. China and Britain were allies during both world wars, so it is entirely conceivable that a small research plane would have been able to fly from London to Beijing. Commercial planes back then were relatively large, designed to transport the rich in luxury, and blimps, of course, were massive, so it is more believable that a small-scale plane would have been able to make the journey. Relationships between the countries were more difficult to research and play a very small role in the story itself. Depending on whether or not the countries in question were diplomatic with each other only affects how the characters would interact with one another. I will now be sharing a few excerpts from Grave of Sand. Gobi Desert, Mongolia, July 3rd, 1927. Hot. It is so bloody hot. We rested around what felt like noon. The sweltering sun, I could tell, was already burning the back of my neck. Consuelos looked exhausted. Laszlo Farrow looked frighteningly pale against the tan desert sand. Our first day in the hot desert felt as though we were living through hell. Sand. Sand is everywhere. No matter which direction I turn, it is all I can see up to the horizon line. Salim figures we landed in the Gobi Desert, given his familiarity with deserts coming from Egypt. Where we are in the Gobi is as yet unknown. We don't even know whether we are in Mongolia or China. We hiked all day, starting from the first rays of dawn until the stars were high above us and we could no longer see. I miss Britain. The muggy weather made the heat of summer bearable, but here, the heat is harsh, and we are unprotected. Gobi Desert, Mongolia, July 10th, 1927. We buried Laszlo Farrow next to the automobile. He was deathly sick, and we all knew he would not live to see Beijing. None of us wanted to stay there, sitting feet away from our friend's body. We headed in a general southeast direction, using the compass from the plane we left behind 7 days ago. At least, I believe it was 7. Not one of us is sure how much time has really passed, but in the desert, it seems as though it has been months. My mouth is dry. Exhaustion has taken root in my legs. Between Consuelo, Salim, and myself, Salim is the one most fitted to be stranded in the desert. Salim leads us, while Consuelos and I carry our supplies between us. We left Laszlo's pack with his body. None of us want to even think about him, let alone be constantly reminded of our dear friend. My neck prickles with sunburn, and I can feel the sandy dirt on my skin. We do not talk much to conserve our energy, and the only sound that breaks the steady silence between us is Salim's directional headings. Out in the desert, it is deadly quiet. There's no sound other than the squelch our boots make in the sand. Recently, I've begun to contemplate whether this is hell. The days drag on forever, and there's not a speck of oasis or a city on the horizon. All there is sand. We stopped to make camp as the sun was sinking below the sand. Consuelos and I nearly collapsed on the spot. I slept for what felt like the first time in days. Gobi Desert, Mongolia, July 11th, 1927. We now know the date is officially July 11th, 1927, and that we are finally approaching the border between China and Mongolia. The Sikh barely spoke to us, so much as to tell us that he was from India, a colony of Great Britain. We did not know where the Sikh was taking us. All we knew was that we could not be very far from a village, or better, Beijing. Although he seemed to dislike us, he was kind enough to spare us some of his water and food. We had been surviving off bread and canned beef ever since we crashed in this godforsaken place. I told the Sikh about Laszlo Farrow. He nodded gravely and reached down to pat my shoulder. That was all the interaction I had with the Sikh. I think he felt sorry for me. We rested as the sun once again was dipped into the horizon. We awake, we walk. The Sikh tells us we are close. I pray to him that we are. The grand finale, a complete and edited version of Fantasy on High. Fantasy on High, a curious blend of stories. A small anthology of 4 short stories that stretch across 4 different genres, from an asylum in Iceland, to aliens in the year 2537, to the Italian mafia, to the Gobi Desert in 1927, a variety of strange and quirky characters come to life. And instead of remaining just a Google document, Fantasy on High really did come to life. In May, my dad and I sent off the finished and edited PDF file that was the completed version of Fantasy on High to a book printing company located in East Vancouver, and the result was 10 paperback copies of my anthology of short stories, Fantasy on High. Seeing and holding these books has by far been the most rewarding part of this long and hard creative process. These stories have taken me to so many places, and I've learned so many things, and I'm glad I got the chance to share it all with you here today. To conclude, Masterworks has been a huge learning experience for me. Mostly, I've learned a lot about myself and what place writing has in my life. Fantasy on High was fun to write. Its characters led me down all new roads of my imagination and challenged my inspirations. I managed to write 4 short stories, one I hadn't even planned on writing until inspiration struck. My anthology consists of a thriller, crime drama, science fiction, and historical fiction story, one for each genre. I immersed myself in the world of my book and managed to go through all the stages in the creative process, and I'm glad I'm finally at the part where I can look back at what I've done and be proud of myself. Writing creatively has always been a strong point of mine, and I hope it always will be. Despite my love of writing, I do not see it as a hallmark in my life. Writing has and always will be one of my passions. It is something I can do on a quiet, rainy day for an hour and then tuck away the story to continue later. I don't have a problem with stepping away from writing for a month or so because I know the characters will always be there, ready to continue their story. So I pursue my ideas. I don't always know where they will lead, but that is half the fun. I am perfectly happy to be a writer in my own time, whether it be for friends or family, or even myself, because as Henry Miller said, writing is its own reward. Firstly, I would like to thank my parents. They really helped me keep me on track and would calm me down when I was freaking out about minor details in the Masterworks process, which happened more than once. They provided an audience for my stories and were always interested in my topic. Secondly, I would like to thank my class for being there for me to bounce story ideas around with, and a few of us managed to come up with some ideas that I will hopefully be able to use in some future story. They always had my back when it came to Masterworks and helped me remain calm throughout the year, mostly by saying, "Don't worry, I haven't done that either." Next, I would like to thank Jen Henriksen. You're always open to have a mini Masterworks meeting, and we're there to keep us all moving in the right direction and prevent us all from falling totally behind. I would like to thank my external advisors, Diane Wood and Michael St. John Smith. You two were both very helpful at all our meetings in Starbucks and over the phone. You both provided some real insight into what writing is like for you both. It was also helpful of you, Michael, when you would tell Charlotte and I about Christopher's experience with Masterworks. So whenever I felt like I was procrastinating, that would make me feel better. I learned so much from you two, and I hope you both do well in your writing courses at SFU. Last, but definitely not least, Charlotte. Thank you for all the help you provided me with throughout the year. And with you by my side as my advisor, I felt less like I was on my own. You, much to my great relief, became my editor, and I am very grateful for that, as I feel the formatting of my stories would otherwise not have been up to par. You were very relaxed, which made me feel like I could go to you with any problem I was having with my Masterworks, and you were always happy to help. And of course, thank you all for coming to see my Masterworks presentation here today, and I hope Fantasy on High was just as fun for you as it was for me. Thank you.